Hey, welcome back. I have a new video for you today, and this time here it is a continuation of the series I'm doing for getting into Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and this one's going to be focusing on picking the edition. I did bring this up in the last video, and I just want to really kind of go into detail here on the options available to us. So the basics that I want to get into here are just basically that in the last video I said that you want to figure out locally if there is already a group in place that's already playing Warhammer Fantasy Battles in some way. And if that's not an option, see if there's anybody in your current gaming group that you have that just has some interest in it, whether they're former players or maybe are intrigued because of Total War or Vermintide. There are people that have been introduced to fantasy because of games, PC games, Xbox games, whatever. Just like, 40K had the influx of players that we saw back in the early to mid 2000s because of Dawn of War. Sometimes you just have people that want to play simply because they've played a computer game, and even if they're not into Warhammer, which means, I guess, really check with your friends who just play video games too. You never know who might be interested. And if you really can't find anybody locally checking around, always check online resources. Reddit and Facebook have lots of groups, just 2 examples, for Warhammer Fantasy of different editions, and you can always check with them if anybody's playing in your area or even, reasonably close, because the system is dead, and the further back into the editions you go, the more dead it sort of is. It might be, reasonable to assume you might have to drive an hour or 2 for a game, which isn't ideal or, something most people want to do. But depending on how big the group is and, transport and such in your country or region, might not be that big of a deal. Like for me, going for an hour-long drive to play Warhammer, that's nothing, because I'll go for groceries that take that long sometimes, if I want to go get better selection than what my small town has. So, an hour drive for Warhammer has never been a problem for me. And the actual editions that I'm going to get into, these can be broken into groups. You have first and second. They're really far from what we consider Warhammer by today's standards. And especially the first edition, it's really an RPG. I think the second edition's not as much, but first and second sort of go hand in hand. Whereas third edition is, to my understanding, where it starts becoming Warhammer Fantasy Battles, closer to what we know. And by the time you get to fifth, you're into sort of the end of that era, but stepping into the more modern Warhammer period. There's an error here, a typo. This should say 6th to 8th is the final trilogy. I'll have to fix that at some point. And each of these build on what came before it, but they're all sort of the same in a lot of ways. As far as like lore and like the way it looks goes. Prior to that, it was really common to see super bright stuff, whereas going into 6th edition, it got grimdark. We started seeing the the dingier looking stuff versus the bright, like Arthurian or like fun fantasy that we had in like 5th edition. Carrying on, so Oldhammer, I'm not going to really go too far into this just because I'm not an Oldhammer player. I have very little experience with it, other than a few times I've read the books. Just get lore or artistic inspiration. And I've played like a couple of games of 5th edition, but again, I really shouldn't be the guy talking about this. The 1st to 4th are primarily where you're going to find a lot of really old gamers. So if you don't know older guys that are playing Warhammer, these guys probably are just playing at each other's houses in their garages and stuff. the couple of times I've run into people who play this, they don't go to stores as far as my experience goes. They play at home, and it's just because they don't want to be bothered usually. I'm not saying they're like grumpy or anything, but it's just they don't want to have to explain what they're doing. And I think a lot of times they've had issues where people will ask them why they're bothering with such old editions when the newer stuff is so much better. And these are probably also guys that aren't going to the stores to buy stuff, so they really don't have a reason to be playing there either. Getting into Oldhammer is probably going to be expensive too, just because the books are really old, so hard to find by comparison. Every edition of Warhammer is expensive to get for the most part in books right now, but I like never see first to fourth edition stuff go up. Like ever. You know, it does happen sometimes. You know, obviously I'm being a little bit of an exaggeration there, but I really seldom see this older stuff going for sale other than models. And these things are all in the, like, you're buying a model, like a soldier, for like £5 or like $10 Canadian type thing for every single guy. It might not be that expensive literally for every model, but if you've ever seen those pictures of sale ads where they have like a grid drawn on paper and it's like A to D up across the top and like 1 to 5 going down or whatever, and it's all gridded off and there's just pewter dudes sitting on it, and you just have to check the rows and columns to see how much each guy costs. It's because they're not selling units usually because of the cost, and because there are so few kicking around, people are just collecting 1 or 2 models at a time a lot, so it's time consuming and it's expensive. Now the old stuff does have a lot of really cool supplements and campaigns. You can find a lot of these as PDFs online just to look at them and get some idea of what people were doing back then. But again, I've never really seen these things coming up for sale. They do once in a while, but it's so rare that I can't even tell you the last time I saw something like this. I do think first edition actually is available in a reprint that came out 12 or so years ago. There was an edition of something that came out that included the first edition rules. It was one of the anniversaries, like 30th year anniversary or something. But otherwise, I mean, it's all just like, it's out there if you want to look for it in PDF form, but it's just something to like think about if you are going to get into this. There is going to be a bit of a treasure hunt aspect. Now, 5th edition, it's a bit more forgiving to get into because this was like the beginning of plastic kits. And as far as collecting armies go, you're really not building huge armies. Back then, it was like 1,500 points was roughly like the regular size, I think. And there wasn't all like the limitations in building armies like we have today. Like there still were some, but it was called Hero Hammer because that was the edition where you could really just like deck out a handful of heroes and give them a couple of units to lead. And I wrote it down there in the side there. I basically call it the Dynasty Warrior edition because even though you don't have to play that way, the game really lets you make your super guy that can just like go and wipe out units on his own, and the guys that are with him are just sort of there. They're helping and stuff, but the reality is that your heroes are doing the real work. Heard people say that this was not like the intention, but it was meant more just to give freedom, but it was really easily abused. So again, it's more of a warning there. If you're getting into this one and you're playing with a group of people you don't know very well, or you do know and you know 1 or 2 of them are like power gamers, supposedly 5th edition can really be power gamed, and it can really take away the fun. But again, that's just down to group dynamics. Any edition, you'll have that. But the books, they're really nice. They're super colorful. The armies are really colorful. And it was like pre-Grimdark. So even though there was like John Blanche stuff out there prior to this, you see it in some of the art that we saw in the 90s. But the overall aspect, like if you look to the side here, that super bright kind of blurry picture, that I have posted here, because I could not get a better one. I believe that is the cover for the 5th edition box. It was like Lizardmen versus Bretonians, and like the back of that box is super bright and cheerful, considering it's a bunch of people killing each other. And yeah, it reminds me of 2nd edition 40k in a lot of ways. Maybe not gameplay, but just like presentation, because I think that was just GW's like design philosophy at the time. Also had a lot of cool campaigns like before, but there is one thing you're going to have to watch out for. Some of the choices of how they sold things was odd. You needed to buy this box for all your magic stuff, so like magic spells and powers and stuff, and they were like cards. I don't know how you really got those other than this box. I know some would have been in the books, but my understanding is you did actually have to get this magic box set. And there were some other ones. I think there was like Realm of Chaos or something, maybe was also one of those weird ones. I don't know about that one though. Again, I'm not really familiar with the Oldhammer stuff and the early Middle Hammer. My time in fantasy really only started in 6th edition around like 2001, 2002. So jumping into that, this is probably one of, if not the most popular editions to play right now. I think the Facebook group is like 6,000 or 7,000 members. And if you assume that even like a quarter of them are pretty active, having like, what's that, like 1,500 to 2,000 people like regularly like taking part is pretty good, considering this edition was out of production around 2004 or 2005, something like that. I want to say it was like 2000 to 2005 that we had this edition. A lot of people have told me this is sort of what they consider like a historical game design, and it's like a fantasy historical. I don't play a lot of historical games, and the ones I have been like Flames of War, so it's more like smaller scale. But I do know around the same time they were releasing Warhammer historical books, and they did seem to be running off of like 6th edition, but like minus orcs and magic and stuff. So I do think that's probably fairly accurate. They had scaled back heroes. The units were the important part. And it was all about getting good maneuvers, getting into the flanks and the rears, keeping blocking units in place, and making sure that the combats you did fight were the ones you needed to fight. You weren't going to win usually in the shooting phase. You weren't going to win in the magic phase. It could happen. It was part of the game. Your hero could go in there and single-handedly do enough wounds to make a unit break. But overall, you were relying on your men getting into like flanks and stuff. Like, for example, one big thing in this edition is that you fight with one rank of men usually. And if they die, they don't get to fight back. There was no step up like we had in 8th edition. So, knights charging in, doing a bunch of damage, might kill, if you're lucky, between the riders and the horses, just 5 of them, maybe 6 or 7 if you have them wider. It might kill the entire front rank, meaning there's no one to fight back. So 6th edition, like I said, there's reasons people really like it. I still play it once in a while. It's not my favorite edition, but I like a lot of what it has to offer. I also think that it has some of the best books in terms of what they offer versus what they cost you to get. They look nice. They're a solid size. They're really durable, and they look good and just feel good to use. And I think every army had one of their book out. I'm pretty sure some of them had 2. Like, for example, dwarves had 2. Dark elves had a revision, if I recall. I don't know if that got printed, but there's definitely a revision because dark elves were terrible when they came out, and there were some changes to make them playable. I'm pretty sure it was printed. Very similar to what happened to Dark Eldar in 40k. GW just didn't know what to do with the evil elves, I guess. But yeah, I think they all have a book, other than like think it was like Chaos Dwarves didn't get their official book, and Dogs Chaos Dwarves and Dogs of War. I think they were the only two 5th edition armies that had books that were then forgotten and left behind. And the only way to play them usually was either to bring out the 5th edition books or use the Ravening Horde. Ravening Hordes was a book that lets you basically have a sort of blank slate army list for everybody. When 6th edition came out, it wiped out all the armies, sort of like you saw in 8th edition 40k, coming from 7th edition. And so everybody used a Ravening Hordes list, which was very minimal. And I've never played a game with it that I can think of, but I've seen it, and yeah, they're quite balanced because there's not a lot of special stuff per army. So, you know, positive and negative there. It's very, I guess you could say, bland, but you're still playing your army. It feels like your army. It's just not got a lot of dedicated extra stuff. But a lot of people say that's the best way to play because it's balanced pretty well. And again, I'm pretty sure those two missing armies were in Ravening Hordes. Now, for the actual game, the units, they're pretty small compared to later editions. And the overall model count is low, which is really nice for getting into it. Every edition needs more and more models. And Warhammer Fantasy 6th edition, I think the standard game was about 2,000 points. So again, 5th edition was about 1,500. It went up by like 33%. Because GW, people will talk about how 8th edition was so bad because there was the big push to make you buy more models, which made it less new player friendly. But this was a thing in Warhammer 6th edition as well. I remember starting armies back in that edition, and it wasn't cheap. You did need to buy multiple boxes. Most boxes had about 20 models in it. Maybe 16, and in some cases 12, like Chaos Warriors. And you usually needed more than 20 models in a unit, which meant that you were probably buying 3 boxes and then making 2 units with that. You might not use all the models, but very seldom is a 20-man unit what you want. That was only more like elves and chaos, dwarves, where you had expensive elite units where you had to like sort of scale back how many you could take. But if you were playing Empire, if you were playing Skaven and Orcs, you weren't buying just like 1 box per unit usually, even though that's how they sort of sold them. So 6th edition, there is a cost of getting into in terms of model count. It's quite easy to hit about 100 models. And I think it's pretty normal to see 60 to 100 models in that game. Unless you go to something like the Ogres. A lot of the early books too, one thing I'm going to bring up is that they were built in a way that I think was more like player friendly, and they included extra lists in the back. So like if you were getting like Empire, you'd have like army lists to play like Nuln, or I think Marienburg was one. Skaven, you could play the different great clans, so Eshin and Scryer, and what are they? Eshin, Scryer, Molder, and Pestilence. You could basically have a list for each one, and they would usually add a new character type and maybe a unit type, and then they would rearrange which units would go into each slot. So like some core would become special or rare, some specials and rares could become core. And this was the same thing with the campaign books. There were 2 or 3. There was like Storm of Chaos and Lustria for sure. I think there might have been one more, but I think it was those 2. And they had some extra lists as well. Some of them were broken, some of them were not. Yeah, like I think like it was the High Elf Sea Guard list, like Lothlorien Sea Guard. You just have a stupid amount of shooting, and it really wasn't something that was going to be fun to play against. So if you get into 6th edition, just make sure everybody is sort of aware of how you all feel about the extra armies, the extra army lists that were available, because not everybody's going to want to play with that stuff. There was General's Compendium though, which added some stuff, like there were like naval battles and stuff you could do if you want to build boats But that's sort of like a chapter approved and all that, just kind of like fun extra stuff. Moving on to 7th, I'm not going to say a lot about this one. Probably the least played in terms of the newer stuff, the newer in quotations. It's basically 6th edition, just a little more refined. But then not all the army books came out, and they were like all over the place as far as balance went. And like some of them were just like, they were not fun to play against. Like say demons, Skaven could be like really powerful. Dark elves, there were just things in there that were kind of absurd that GW put them in. And yeah, some people will say that if you take 7th edition core rules, but then you use the 6th edition army books like everybody did at the start, that it's a pretty good edition, and probably it's better than playing 6th edition pure. But that's really just down to again, preference, and maybe just even getting a hold of stuff. Like for years I thought I had a 7th edition rule book, but I guess I don't even have a mini one, so I'd have to dig one out and find one, and I just haven't come across one for a good price. So I don't know, maybe a lot of people didn't buy into 7th or something, or they just lost their books, or they just don't sell them or whatever. But 7th edition, I've had trouble finding a book just to add to my collection. 8th edition, this is probably the most known because of Total War and Vermintide. Those games are based very much on that version of Warhammer and what it looked like. So it's the last edition, and it's also the edition that people shit on just because of the end times. Which is not just because of the end times, but specifically because end times came and Age of Sigmar came and the old world blew up and died. There's other problems, like you have way too many models that you need. So the game's super expensive to buy into, like I was saying earlier. They added things like hordes, and some stuff was too powerful, especially things like magic. It's just kind of like the edition, they made choices that I like and choices I don't like. And yeah, it's an interesting one. So it's incomplete for one. Just want to get that out of the way. Beastmen, Bretonnians, and Skaven did not get books in 8th edition. And only the Skaven got a 7th edition book. Or sorry, no, Beastmen did. It was Bretonnians are still rocking a 6th edition book. Thankfully, it's not too bad. Some people will tell you they're terrible in 8th edition. I've seen them do very well. But, you have to really focus on a certain type of list, because otherwise it doesn't work. They are, they're the least flexible as a result. Skaven, we got lucky. That book's really good. It was one of the more powerful ones in 7th edition. It's quite good in 8th edition. I really wish it had gotten an 8th edition book just for my shelf purpose, but because 8th edition actually cuts back the number of magic items every army gets, I'm sort of happy it didn't happen, because I have a crazy amount of magic items in my Skaven book from 7th that I would just outright have not had. 8th edition, on average, you had like, let's say 8 or 10 magic items in total, because you were expected to use the common magic items that were in the core book at the back. Beastmen, apparently, they just suck. I've seen them play really well. Again, I think it's just down to generals knowing what to do with them, and building a list that works, knowing how they work and building a list that takes advantage of that. But they are definitely one of the more weak books as a result, because they also really weren't super powerful in 7th. Skaven had that benefit that they were powerful. Bretonnians weren't too bad in 6th edition. They really needed their book, and the legend is that their book was finished and ready to be printed when the official final word came down just to kill it. And instead of release it, they just locked it away. Even if that's not true, though, Beastmen, Bretonnians, and Skaven probably all have 8th edition books. Very rough ones, but definitely would have them, because it's been made clear that Creative Assembly has made every army based off of 8th edition army books, and where they weren't available, GW wrote them for them. Um, again, Bretonnia may have already been ready to go and they just got that copy. Could have been the same for Beastman and Skaven even. But we do know, for example, Kislev and Cathay, their books are written and were sent over to Creative Assembly to be added to Warhammer Total War 3. So I would imagine these three also have books, even if they're super rough. They exist, the basic rule presentation, so that the Creative Assembly guys knew what to include and how to include it. Now, these books are also the nicest ones, so it's a real shame that we lost out on getting 3. They're hardback, got like basically full color, the most complete lore that we have as a result of being the final edition. And they're also, unfortunately, the most expensive to get. You can get lucky and score a book for $15-20 pretty handily. Oh, here goes my phone. But you also could wind up paying $100 for a book. Some of them were really not bought in large numbers, and people do sort of hoard and hang on to these things. They don't come up very often. So really, you see a lot of things like the Empire, the Orcs, the Lizardmen, the Ogres. They're pretty standard, common, I guess, to see out there. But then some like the High Elves and the Daemons, they came out near the end. Same with Dwarves. They're harder to find. And also, I think because like High Elves and Dwarves, for example, got hit so hard, that there's people who just, like I said, they greedily hold on to those books. So they're hard to get. It took me a while to find those two specifically. And I got really lucky basically finding them. Now, like 7th edition, it did sort of make the game bigger. 7th edition was a bit bigger than 6th edition, but still relatively, acceptably sized. 8th edition sort of went out the window on sizing, I can admit, even though I like it. The games are averaging around usually 2,400 points that I was playing back when it was current. Some people played a bit more, some people played a bit less, but 2,400 was pretty much sort of like what I saw everybody playing. And it's what I pretty much always played. Also, the units are huge. You're talking like 30 plus models per regiment, per block of troops is pretty much standard for foot troops. Taking 10 cavalry was not uncommon. Even the bigger like monster type infantry like ogres and rat ogres and Kroxigor, you weren't taking like 3, maybe 4 like you were before, sometimes even just 2. You were taking, well, I guess ogres were different. You were always taking like 3 to like 6 normally, maybe a bit more, because they were like your basic troop was an ogre. But I went from using like 2 or 3 rat ogres to figuring out how to get 18 rat ogres into a list, because you could fit more of them usually, but also there was huge benefits to taking large units of them. 40 millimeter squared units, like square base units, they would fight with all their attacks if they were in 3 ranks that were 6 wide, making a horde. So a 18-man rat ogre unit was something I tried to figure out how to field, and I think I maybe did once, but it was just too much of a pain to try to get that on the table. But thankfully, because of Island of Blood, you could get rat ogres for like dirt cheap at the time. So I did have them, I just never really used them. Yeah, I've already said this, but the books did lose out on magic items. You would have like usually 2 or 3 pages, maybe 4 pages in the 6th and 7th edition books, because you'd have like a few items that were armor, a few weapons, a few banners, a few arcane, a few enchanted items and talismans and whatnot. And then all of a sudden you were down to like 2 pages, really spread out, and you'd have like 10 items at most. And some armies didn't even have something for every slot, I don't think. I think there were some armies that might not have like a banner or something. Maybe I'm wrong on that. I hope I am, but I'm pretty sure there's 1 or 2 that you're like, hey, I didn't get like an enchanted item, or I only got 1. So I felt the armies got really bland in that sense. Because you were all just using like common magic items, which was a neat idea. But I think it worked better when they were just like, everybody had lots of different items and there was a small common magic pool at the start of every magic item section. So like your enchanted shields, your dispel scrolls, those were common. And then you had all the cool, neat army specific stuff. All right, I'm going to stop talking about 8th and move on. 8th is, like I said, it's the one I play the most, the one I like the most. I think it looks the best in terms of like how it just appears on the table. But that's all personal preference. You know, you might really think the first edition looks the best, and I'm not going to say you're wrong because you're not. But then you get into fan editions. I didn't have a cool picture to put here. Maybe just putting a picture of a fan, but I thought that was stupid. There are a few. There's one specifically that's only in Spain, as far as I can tell. Like, I keep hearing it's going to get translated to English, and apparently it's amazing. It's the best version out there. But if you aren't going to translate it so I can see it, I can't take that other than just that's someone's opinion. But apparently there's an amazing Spanish fan version. But we'll see. Maybe one day it'll actually come in English and, you know, they'll prove themselves right. But I don't know. It's been years. I keep hearing it and nobody's ever translating it. It's always soon. But the two I'm going to focus on, they're available in English and they seem to be the most globally accepted ones. And they're attractive, I think, to a lot of people because unlike the older ones, they're not dead. They're still being worked on. They're still being updated. They're being tweaked. FAQs are coming. Rewrites are coming. And on top of that, they're free. I don't think you have to pay a dime for either of them. I've never seen. Maybe you can make like a donation through PayPal or something, or Patreon, but it's just some guys making something that they love. It's a passion project. It's for the community. And I think it's just a pretty cool thing they do. So that's one pretty neat thing to think of, is that it won't cost you a huge amount just getting into it on books. Although you would have to print this stuff or keep it on a digital. Although a lot of people seem to like digital stuff now, so it might not be that big of a deal. So Warhammer Armies Project. This one here, can't think of the guy's name who writes it, but he started off possibly doing this in 7th. I don't know. The oldest posts on his website seem to go back to like 2010 and suggest that he was just going to continue working on 8th edition. So I'm taking it that he was doing something in 7th. But what's good about what he has done so far is that it feels like 9th edition. Now, there are changes in there that he thought were sensible. And I've heard people say they don't like them. I've heard people say they love them, and that this guy got Warhammer more than GW did. This is one of those things where, as always, it's personal preference. And you just basically have to take a look at it to see what's there. But there's a lot. So originally, when I first found it, it was 8th edition stuff. Either it was rewrites of 8th edition books or it was filling in the gaps. So like 8th edition Bretonia, 8th edition Skaven, and 8th edition Beastman. He was doing other stuff as well, but over time he was adding like little tiny like sub-factions and whatnot. But then he moved into 9th edition. He decided to take his stuff and make it 9th. And most of it's ready to go. I think all the main armies are done. Most of the important supplements are done. The rule book's definitely done. And they're still getting updates. People are playing it. People are giving feedback. There's discussions. I think there's a Discord where you can go and really discuss it. And what's really cool is that his books are presented like 8th edition army books, but they're really long. They're like 200 plus pages because he digs out lore pieces from older editions. He's brought in units from older editions and special characters. Maybe not everything is there, but most things are. Now, he used to, I believe, have books that had a lot more magic items. But his 9th edition stuff, as far as I can tell, he really did go to the direction of GW. And everybody has limited magic items. Probably my least favorite thing he did because I like having a lot of magic items, like I said. But it's not bad either, because there is one thing to be said about lots of magic items, is that there's more room for broken combinations and just unfair advantages. If the magic items are sort of like meh for the army you're playing, and somebody else has like pretty good ones or really good ones that are sort of like no-brainers, I can see why not having too many and sharing the common pool is better. And like I said, he goes into like the lore and digs out like sub factions and like old fan favorites like the Chaos Dwarves and Dogs of War. You can see like there's like cults of Ulrich, and even goes into like the distant lands. So you're going to see Cathay and Ind and Araby. They all have lists in here, or at least they will. So that's a really cool addition. Oh, and one other thing that's neat about these, I think it was written on the last page, but these editions, because they're not technically official Warhammer products, even though this one says it is, sort of, they are miniature agnostic, meaning you don't need Warhammer models, you just need appropriate fantasy models. And this guy has a section of his page, or at least he used to, I think it's still there, where you could see suggested alternative units for every army. And in some cases you needed it, like I'm going to make an Araby list, or an Ind list, or a Cathay list. Well, those never had models, at least not in like 28mm or like any time in like the recent past. So where do you get them? And he helps you find stuff. The people that were making the community come together, or bring the community together, they put suggestions out there. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can find. And again, it does seem to be one person. So one benefit to this is one person is doing it. It's not a mix of people taking turns writing, or writing at the same time. And then, your book is written by somebody who's like refrained. And then the next guy is Matt Ward. So kind of, that's a good thing. It does make it slow though. Then you got Ninth Age. Now this one here, this one's funny because this was basically made as a response to the End Times and Age of Sigmar. These were competitive players, specifically a couple of guys or 3 guys, whatever, who were part of the Swedish comp system like group. And what they did is they made like tournament rules that were used in fantasy, to make it like more tournament like and more competitive. And sort of like they took this quite personally when the old world died. And what they did is they started working on their own rule set that essentially just took Warhammer Fantasy, rewrote the names, started working on the rules, added new rules where they saw fit of things that they thought should have been in the game anyways. Like I believe they added pikes as an option for most armies, where you could actually like form a pike wall phalanx that would give you bonuses against cavalry charges, things like that. And over time, it's really it's picked up among the competitive players. Early on, I will say that when I first looked at it, I was turned off because the players were sort of dismissive of people. They were arrogant at times, I found. And it wasn't a super welcoming community, because it was like it was the tournament players, and they're not always the most welcoming people. And I'm not saying anything bad about tournaments. I went to plenty. But tournaments often brought out the worst in people because it was money on the line. So at times I felt early on this wasn't it didn't look so great. It wasn't a good look because there was a lot of that mentality there. But that's changed. The game has very much opened up with like the beer and pretzel, as I call it, and many people call it, view. There's like narrative play, and it's not just tournament play basically. And they've really started working on the world. Like there's more to it now than just here are human warriors of this variety versus here's human warriors of a different variety. These guys have horses. Now they all have their own their army names that are more like set, and they have lore about who they are, where they're from. There's maps and all kinds of stuff. And yeah, it's pretty neat looking. And also, if you've ever seen this, you might recognize this. You actually can buy model kits that are designed for this game. Avatars of War, for example. I know they at least used to make units for this game. So this seal here, if you ever see that, it's because somebody's making models for this game, which is actually really interesting in terms of like community buy-in. Finally, I'm just going to get into Old World really quick again. We don't know anything about this. That's the big takeaway. I said things like, you know, we knew this or that, and we do know it's 28 millimeter. We do know it's square bases. We know the setting, but we don't know anything else really. Is it coming next year or is it coming in 3 years? COVID came along and really screwed things up. And I think realistically, we could have expected it this year if COVID had never come. But then it might be 2 more years because COVID cost them 2 years. Some people have said it's probably canceled. I don't believe it's canceled, but GW obviously is pushing towards 10th edition 40k. Age of Sigmar just got their newest edition last year, I think. Middle Earth just got a new edition. Horus Heresy just got a new edition, which is why I'm thinking we won't see this for 2 years. I think that's probably where we're at 2024. Not what I like to say. It's not what I want to hear, but I think that's realistic. It would be cool if this came out next year. I don't think we'd see it before next year. You know, there's no surprise coming in November kind of thing. But maybe April it could be. I don't know. Maybe this will be something to like sort of just put out in the dry period before 10th edition is coming. That could make sense. They're going to be working on a lot of stuff for Horus Heresy. They're going to be working on some stuff for Middle Earth like they always do. But 10th edition is going to come out in the summer, most likely. Probably even late summer. If they want to like, or you know, if they're not ready or want to stretch it out. So even early summer, you know, June. That's a lot of months into the year to not really have big releases. This might be a good big release to throw out there early to mid, say, like I said, April, just to get people hyped about something and spending a bunch of money. But I think probably 2024 is more likely. Anyways, where was I here? Yeah, I don't think anyone should expect anything of this right now. There might be stuff you love about 40 or about fantasy that's not going to make it, and stuff that you hate, and it's going to be like, you know, prominent. Everybody has their opinion of which edition is better, and because we don't know what they're doing with this, there's no point even really getting excited about what's coming or prepping specific stuff because we don't know. I think most things will stay available. I don't think they're going to like take away a lot of stuff that we have in like, say, 8th edition, 7th edition books. But the way you use them might be different. So we'll see. So basically, if you're looking at Warhammer Fantasy, build an army and play with it now. Pick an edition that already is out there that people are playing and go with that. Don't be just waiting for this, is what I'm saying. Just because it's gonna be a while, and you know, a lot of people are waiting for this, myself included. And I've, you know, done so much Warhammer Fantasy gaming and modeling and hobbying and collecting the last couple of years since they announced it. But in reality, it doesn't matter what I'm collecting or why I'm collecting it. I'm not doing it really for this. When this comes, you know, my 3,000 point ogre army hopefully is still playable. Will it be 3,000 points? Will it be 2,000 points because of changes? Will it be 5,000 points because of changes? I don't know. Nobody does. I think all of it will be usable, but that's not necessarily true. So it's kind of a, geez, I'm getting a lot of messages from eBay. I made like one bid and I'm just getting like assaulted. Although maybe that means I won. We'll find out. But yeah, getting excited for Warhammer through the old world or because of the old world is fine, but like I wouldn't be building because of this, because you don't know what's coming. There's people out there that are like putting out videos and big discussions online about how, oh, you know, got to get this and this, and these are the things you should buy. And I don't think that makes sense. If you want to build an army right now, just build it. If it works out that it's still usable as it is in old world, that's awesome. But like, don't be upset if it isn't, is what I'm saying. So yeah, oops. That is like the end of this. This video is crazy long now. One of those videos. Hopefully this is like helpful to people, and just let me know in the comments. And if you like what I'm doing here, give me a like. You can, you know, subscribe, and I'm going to keep putting these out. The next one, I'm not sure which one I'll do, honestly. I'll probably just maybe take a look at like one of the armies. I have a book for 6th to 8th edition, just so I can sort of like give a comparison of what the books look like in those 3 editions. And maybe even do one video on the rule books. But those are all going to be so big that I'm not sure that's really a feasible way to do it. So give me a couple of days to think on how the next video is going to be presented. But also, if you have any thoughts or suggestions or like your requests, let me know down below. Anyways, thanks for watching, and